you some idea of the landscape of Hampi, which everyone who's been there will know is an astonishingly dramatic vista of huge boulders, great vast granite boulders in which shrines and temples and other buildings are placed. And those, it's the photographer's dream, Hampi, if you go there. But going back to the earliest days of photography, or before that, the earliest item in the British Library's collection relating to Hampi is, again, I'm afraid it's very difficult to see. This is a map made by the surveyor and British Army officer and antiquarian Colin Mackenzie in 1800. It's the first visual record that we have of Hampi, and it's a careful plan of the sites with buildings noted. So it forms a very important record of Hampi in its deserted state at the beginning of the 19th century. And there are a number of watercolours and paintings in the British Library's collection, but my field is photography, so we're going to go straight on to that. Photography and archaeology in British India was stimulated by the East India Company, who in 1853 officially allowed a photographer to travel around in southern India collecting images of archaeological sites. The first sort of project was in 1855 by a man named Thomas Biggs, and his superiors then brought him back to military business and questioned why he was out taking photographs when he was meant to be an army officer. But his job was continued by a man called William Henry Pigue, who in 1856 was the first photographer, or one of the first photographers, to visit Hampi, and he took a series of photographs of the site as it existed in the mid-1850s. This is a view that is actually repeated by quite a number of other photographers of the view of the Virupaksha temple from Hemakuta Hill. It's a good general view of the site. And in fact, an almost identical view was taken by another photographer called Alexander Greenlaw at around about the same period. Greenlaw is an intriguing character. His photographs were, well, contemporary prints don't appear to survive of his negatives, but his negatives survive. And in fact, John's colleague, George Michel, who did a book about Vijayanagara, used Greenlaw's photographs very extensively to record Hampi in the mid-1850s. Later prints from his negatives are in the V&A Museum. This is a slight sort of segue because, unfortunately, the British Library doesn't hold this material. But returning to Pigue, we can see that he took a number of photographs of the main temple sites and principal buildings, and also of the great monolithic Narasimha image. And I include this because it does make the point about photography from this period that it is an important resource for looking at what has happened to these monuments since. As you can see, a modern photograph shows how extensive the restoration of this image has been in succeeding years. I don't know when the Narasimha image was restored.
1980s.
Quite recently, yeah. And probably a rather ill-advised piece of work, but such is life. And of course, the great Vitala temple, Pigue took a number of photographs of that. Interestingly, these archaeological projects, which were pushed forward with great enthusiasm and then largely forgotten, Biggs and Pigue's negatives from the mid-1850s were, I mean, of course, the Indian rebellion ensued after that, and people had more important things to think about. Finances were constrained, and these negatives, in fact, were not printed until the following decade, into the mid-1860s, when some of them were published in a volume called Architecture of Darwa and Mysore. which was published with the sponsorship of various rich Indians. Another photographer who was involved with that publication was a man called Andrew Neil, who doesn't appear to have been working officially, but seems to have gone to Vijayanagara and various other sites just out of his own personal interest, but took a number of extremely interesting photographs of Vijayanagara. And this view of the great stone temple car at the Vitala temple is important because a lot of work, again, a lot of restoration work of one sort or another was subsequently done to this structure. And these records are really some of the only records we have of what it looked like at this time. A few private individuals also visited Vijayanagara, one of whom was Robert Sellan, an army officer who appeared to have just gone on his own initiative to Vijayanagara, but took some interesting photographs, not only of the temple sites, but of the sort of urban centre of the elephant stables and other sites at Vijayanagara. But we then come on to the next officially sponsored photographer or government photographer to visit Vijayanagara. Edmund David Lyon was a professional photographer at Uttakamund in the 1860s. And he was first of all commissioned by the Madras government to travel and take photographs, which then became government property. And he visited Vijayanagara in 1867 or 68 and took a large and important series of views. And he had an interesting approach. Because he was a commercial photographer, he clearly had an interest in being able to market this material at a later date. So when he came back to England or back to Europe in about 1870, 71, he published a series of notes relating to these photographs of South India. Let me just show you a few more examples. He's really wonderful compositions of looking at the site. Again, here's another photograph of the Vitala temple showing the great stone car in the middle of the scene. But with each of these photographs, he gave a text, and it is almost like a sort of guidebook. Looking at 1867, 68, one's reaching a period where more travellers were coming to India, where the tourist industry was actually starting to expand. So his photographs not only were used by government and commissioned by government, but they were marketed for a commercial audience who might use them as almost a guidebook. And in many of his photographs, he tells you where you might stay in the region, what's the best means of traveling to it, what is the best route through the ruins to take and to see them to their best advantage. So this is a new sort of approach to documenting a site. Again, an image by Lyon. Quite interesting. I don't think you can probably see it in this light, but when you look at the negatives of these photographs, very often the clouds are painted in by the photographer because the technology of photography at that stage tended to reproduce a very bland, blank sky, a rather boring photograph. So Lyon, along with a number of photographers, used to paint in the clouds to give a little bit of interest in the background to the image. After Lyon, again, a number of official photographers were commissioned by the Indian government. The Duke of Buckingham, who was governor of Madras at this period, was interested in archaeology and had quite a serious interest and actually wrote about Lyon's photographs. But he visited Vijayanagara in 1880 and he took with him an anonymous photographer whose the technical quality of his work is not as high as photographers by Lyon, but in my opinion, it's actually extremely interesting. He does two views of the Bazaar Street in Hampi, one looking towards the Virupaksha temple and one looking the other way towards the Nandi Pavilion and other shrines at the end of the street. And I don't think any other photographer actually took these images. He had sort of unusual approach to subject matter at Hampi. For instance, this is a very interesting photograph which shows how the site was now being used for, see how there are paddy fields in the foreground, general agricultural work throughout the site. And it's it's rather unusual take on the subject. I say the technical quality is not as high as some of them, but as documentary images, they're extremely interesting. And later, Henry Hardy Cole in 1881, who was the son of Henry Cole, the founder of the Victoria and Albert Museum, became conservator of ancient monuments in India, and during a period of 4 or 5 years managed to enrage almost everyone he came across. But he did visit Vijayanagara, and his photographs are interesting because they're much more concerned with the damage done to the monuments rather than producing picturesque views. So they're an important record of the decrepit state of quite a lot of the monuments at this period. Again, we slip back briefly to Lion, partly because I got my slides in the wrong order, I have to confess. But a rather beautiful picture of the what's known as the Lotus Mahal in Vijayanagara, which was photographed, I think, by every photographer who visited Vijayanagara. And again, if I bring this briefly to an end, Lion also photographed the Ramachandra temple, took several views of it. But what is interesting is that James Ferguson, the great architectural historian of India in the 19th century, always complained about photographers, because although he was a great advocate of photography, but he complained that photographers took photographs, but what was really needed with those photographs was architectural plans and elevations, because without those, the images are actually very difficult to assess the architectural material in front of you. And I make that point because we come on now to an image of that temple, a fine architectural elevation produced for the Vijayanagara Research Project, which over a period of how many years? 20, 30 years
22.
Were you working? Has really produced what is one of the on an international scale, is one of the great archaeological documentation projects. Some of this material is going to be used in the exhibition, which will be at the British Library, but what is important is that the archive of the research project is now housed at the British Library. So the library's collection relating to the archaeological documentation of Vijayanagara dates from Mackenzie's first map in 1800 up to near present day archaeological research on the site, through all the 19th century photographs that are held in the library. So it is really a remarkable record of one site in India, one of the most important sites in India, but also one of the most important documentation projects. And with that, I'm going to ask John to speak on the site, on his work, and perhaps we will open it up with any questions that you might have about what we've been talking about. Oh, actually, just before I go, I did mention that some of the original negatives from Pigue's and Lyon's work in India are held by the library. These are astonishing survivals. The survival of original negatives from the 19th century is very, very rare. However well kept photographs are, they fade over time. None of the photographs that we have at the present day look exactly as they were produced in the 19th century. However, negatives are not so susceptible to that fading. They're susceptible, in the case of glass negatives, to breakaging and whatever. But on the whole, one can produce, allied to digital technology, one can produce remarkable facsimiles from the original negatives, which is part of the project that we hope to work with CSMVS. We might talk a bit more about that if you're interested, but at this stage, I will finally hand you over to John to talk to you.
Thank you very much, John. I'm very grateful to John because he was the one who really encouraged us to organize our material in a way that it could be given to the British Library. You know, the one thing about the Vijayanagara project is that it never was institutionally based. Neither George Michel, who started the work at Vijayanagara, or myself had an institutional base in the sense that we were teaching and we had graduate students and access to facilities. So we sort of had to make it up as we went along. And we had this vast volume of material. Our children didn't want it, and so, but the British Library did, and we're very grateful that they have been so supportive of our work, and that this body of material will be available for the future. Now, the project was started in 1980 by George Michel, who lives in London, an Australian architectural historian, who has many publications on Indian architecture, and he had just finished his work documenting a place called Badami in northern Karnataka, and he came down to the Hampi, to the site on the Tungabhadra River, and was intrigued by the number of monuments that were standing and the diversity across a great landscape. So he proposed to a gentleman called Mukraj Anand, who some of you may have heard of, who was the editor of a magazine published in Mumbai, an arts magazine called Marg, to do an issue on Hampi. And Mukraj Anand came down to Hampi in 1980 and was blown away by the interesting architecture and the landscape. But even more, he was blown away by the fact that George had been able to assemble a large number of Indian and foreign architecture students who all lived in the monuments because there's no other place to live in. And they sort of put down bedrolls in a temple, or abandoned temple, and camped around a tourist canteen in the middle of the site. And he loved this documentary process, which is really part of our story. And so they produced an issue of Marg magazine in 1981. I met George in London, having given the paper at a seminar in Cambridge, and he showed me his drawings, his photographs of the site. Now I have to say that I'm not an Indologist. It was purely accidental that I got involved in this project. I had worked mostly in the American Southwest, and I dug various sites, Native American sites, prehistoric sites. But one of the things I got very interested in working in one particular area was how the way that sites were laid out. Was there particular formal plans or layouts for these sites? And not only at the level of sort of civic buildings, civic structures like religious spaces, which are called kivas in the Southwest, but also in the way that certain settlements are laid out as a whole on the landscape. So I wrote about this, and this is what I gave a seminar on at Cambridge. So George showed me the drawings that he began to produce. They were maps of where the sacred buildings are concentrated along the Tungabhadra Dam, Tungabhadra River, and also the area where the palaces are concentrated. And I saw that there was organization. There was north-south axes and east-west orientations and all kinds of things that those of you from India will know very well from your temple-going experience. But for me, that was a revelation, and I got very enthusiastic about it. So I was able to raise some money to come to India in 1981, and George then was beginning to expand these maps of the site, and we just walked around and saw how things were laid out. Very interesting. And for various reasons, there was pots of money available for the kind of work we wanted to do through a U.S. government agricultural support program. And so I was able to raise money to not only bring myself and George, but some others eventually, some other graduate students, and also to support many volunteer architects and archaeologists from Australia, from India, from America, from the continent. And over the years, we had more than 250 volunteer of these people, architects, etc. And they really made the project work. And many of the drawings, the great majority of the drawings that are now in the library are produced by these, I would call them amateur, but young, up-and-coming architects. And many of them went on to make a mark in their separate countries. George also was able to bring in one of his buddies who turned out to be one of Australia's most eminent architectural photographers, John Gallings. And some of his photographs are also included in the collections here. And he had a very heroic vision of the monuments, as did some of the 19th century photographers. So he was able to produce wonderful images that we showed when we gave lectures and we did publications, and that was very important for the development of our project, to communicating the importance of this site. So where to go from there? Over the years, we increasingly tried to involve other scholars in our work. We had people interested in art history. We had people interested in religious history, and many of them wrote volumes on our work and we published them. Then we expanded our documentation both in terms of area covered and in terms of the intensity of documentation. For example, we drew up every monument, 1 to 400 scale, plan, section, and elevation, both religious and royal courtly architecture. And then we also made maps of the whole site, or the central part of the site. We made maps of about 11 hectares in area, 11 square kilometers in area. And then a sister project came up, run by two women who got their PhDs with us, and they tried to document the area around the central city. So the city has a core, it's about 24 square kilometers, which has this royal section where the palaces are located, and a sacred section along the Tungabhadra River. But around that, and enclosed in increasingly extensive outer walls, were suburban areas where agriculture was carried out, and where water was collected and controlled and brought into the city, and provided outer protection. One of the students of these two women was able to map some of the outer fortifications, and the area covered by the outermost fortifications we know about is about 600 square kilometers. So the area protected was gigantic. Most of that area was not densely occupied. It was just, there were villages and roads, and probably a lot of places where goats were herded, and all that kind of agrarian landscape. And even within the inner core of the city, not all the parts of the city were intensely occupied. Now, I feel that it's very important to make maps. George made a very good sketch maps that we use for understanding the inner layout of the city. But I wanted to make a much more detailed maps. And so we hired a Bangalore surveyor, a retired officer of the Survey of India, to bring in his teams. And over the next 12 years, we made 1 to 400 scale maps. That is, 1 meter is, 10 meters. 100 meters is represented by 40 centimeters on the map. And that showed us, and we recorded everything we could see on the surface. Hampi is famous for these monuments, but there also were an awful lot of things besides monuments that I, as an anthropologically oriented archaeologist, wanted to record. You've seen the great granite outcrops in Hampi, but there are smaller outcrops that were lived on intensively, and people modified them. They, for example, made holes or mortars where they pounded their rice and processed their food. They also they might write inscriptions in some areas. They sculpted very small religious icons, or in some cases much bigger religious icons. And there were little cubicle holes where they would put plugs, and then they would put slabs on top of the stone plugs, and then they would build up from there. So that tells us the density of occupation in certain parts of the site. And what we discovered from that is that mostly the eastern part of the site was not occupied, of the inner walled area was not occupied. It was in fields. We are fortunate to have Portuguese visitors who came in the 16th century to Hampi and recorded their impressions. And one of the first people to really write extensively about Hampi and the Vijayanagara Empire was a man named A.L. Longhurst, who was a government official. And he published a book in 1900 called Vijayanagara, A Lost Civilization. And in that, he translated many of these Portuguese accounts. And so that's a very interesting way of understanding his vision of the city. What else can I talk about? So I was going back to these surface remains. One of the things that Longhurst recorded in these Portuguese texts was that one of the greatest kings of Vijayanagara, named Krishnadevaraja, who ruled in the first quarter of the 16th century, conducted a series of campaigns against Muslim sultanates that were their competitors to the north in the northern Deccan, but they also had campaigns against the Orisan Hindu kingdoms who were pushing down the coast into what we now know as Andhra Pradesh. And he involved Portuguese gunners. There were Portuguese traders in the Vijayanagara site, but there were also Portuguese gunners. And those people came and shot, with the rest of as a component of the army, and helped to conquer parts of this territory, or reconquer parts of this territory that were taken by the Orisan Hindu kings. So the sideline, but it's important to realize that we have contemporaneous accounts of this place, although it's very hard, if they describe the landscape and the actual monuments at the site, it's very hard to correlate what we see today with what they described in the 16th century.
So after 1565, when the site is essentially deserted. Is there any? This always intrigues me about archaeological sites, because when you read, not just at Hampi, British accounts of archaeology, they go to a place and they generally describe it as deserted or in ruins or whatever, and you never get a sense of what life there must be. And there must have been, I mean, I believe the Virupaksha temple was still used after, was still a religious center after 1565. But it's that sort of lost period of local life. Is there anything in the archaeology that tells us what happened in that period and what activity there was in that period?
In the early 19th century, there were foreign visitors. There was a Frenchman who came and recorded inscriptions, and of course, there were, even in the 17th century, there were, or let's say late 18th century, there were some Italians who came through and recorded their impressions. We have both archaeological evidence and for the first few decades after the city was destroyed in 1565, there were some of these visitors encountered local governors for the Bijapur kingdom, which controlled this area. We also have archaeological evidence where some of the palaces were reconfigured. The previous base was maintained, but new kinds of architecture were built on top of them. Now that's not been very well documented, but we have noted it. So I think there was some attempt, both by the Bijapur conquerors of Vijayanagara, and there's also some inscriptions that say that some of the later Vijayanagara kings, in the next couple of decades, signed documents in the presence of Virupaksha. So did they actually, who was the reigning deity of the site, and does that mean they actually were living there, or they just wanted to indicate that they still had a connection to it? But of course, I mean, a city of whatever it was, a couple 100,000 people, it disappeared in a way, but the agriculturalists were still there, and I'm sure that slowly over the next few decades, people began to occupy some of the monuments, particularly since some of them were in walled compounds, which give a certain amount of security. And some of the early photographs show local towns like Kamalapur with people living in the streets and carrying out agriculture. And your picture of the Vijayanagara Bazaar, the Hampi Bazaar, showing agricultural fields, I mean, that was all going on too. And Hampi perhaps was abandoned. Hampi village itself and the Virupaksha temple itself was abandoned perhaps for a time, but it does seem to have carried on as a regional religious center. And what's particularly interesting to us, we came to realize that there's modifications to the Virupaksha temple and also buildings built in the Virupaksha Bazaar, the colonnaded bazaar street, that are much more recent than the Vijayanagara occupation, probably dating, we're not absolutely certain, but possibly dating to the early 19th century. And there's a great tower in front of the Virupaksha temple, and that's attributed to a local saint. So we think that maybe that the great Gopuram in the front of the temple was rebuilt, and it has many Islamic architectural details. We haven't talked about the Islamic component in Vijayanagara architecture, but even in the 19th century, I don't think people really cared about the sectarian dimensions of this or that architectural form. But this, a great gateway, has a truly vaulted entryway and has decorative details that are more come from Islamic decoration of that period than they do from Hindu architecture, but it's a Hindu monument leading into the sanctuaries of this most more important temple in the site. So certainly in the 19th century, the site was occupied and the religious rites were going on. What happened in the latter 18th century is a little unclear. There's a question?
Oh, 5 minutes. Yeah,
I'm happy to take questions.
I believe you've got a short film you'd like to show, John, is that correct?
No, I didn't have a phone.
No.
Nobody told me about it. Yeah?
Thank you.
So, ladies and gentlemen, we have the opportunity for some questions, and my colleague will come round with a roving mic if you'd just like to raise your hand, if you have one. Thank you very much. Madam.
Thank you both very much for the sharing. I've got a question for you, John, if I may, about photography in India in the 1840s, because I'm aware it was occurring, pioneering photography, including with botanical specimens in the 1840s within the East India Company, and I'd be very grateful if you could perhaps comment.
Well, there appears to have been a very limited amount of photography, and very little has survived. I know of a couple of albums from the late 1840s, 1848, 49. There do appear to have been some experiments with photogenic drawings, where you put a botanical specimen on a sensitized sheet of paper and make an impression. So that's without a camera. That's sort of, if you have sensitized paper and you put, say, a flower on it and expose it to light, then you get an image of the flower. And I think there are some tentatively attributed examples of that from India. It was quite a common hobby at that time because it was very simple to do, whereas photography with a camera tended to start getting a little bit complicated. Yeah, there's a remarkably little material surviving from India. You have some, do you?
I know about some.
Right.
I'm searching somebody who was out in the East India Company, and he was one of the pioneers.
Oh, well, I'd love to hear more about it if you're willing
It's going to
to.
be coming out in a book.
Excellent.
But
Wonderful.
If I might have your
Yes, by all means, yeah. Because there is so little that can be definitively attributed. As I say, I know of one album from the late 1840s, which certainly was being made around 48, 49. There's a chap called John McCosh as well, who was active, yes, as early as that. But so little has survived that if you have material from that date, then it's exceedingly rare. Yeah. Well, I very much look forward to seeing that in. Excellent. Yeah.
Hi, I have absolutely been enthralled by this your photographs today. I'm very privileged to have been spent 3 days in Hampi. And it's quite sad I went through some of my photographs, and obviously 100 years, 200 years, there's been a lot of destruction. I wanted to ask you why Hampi hasn't been given the kind of importance in history globally. So if you look at any lost civilizations documentaries, it doesn't feature. And in my view, Hampi is far superior than, is it the Khmer in Angkor Wat? You see the Easter Island, all of those feature, and Hampi doesn't. Why is Vijayanagara not, seen to be one of those top 10 lost civilizations? That's my first question. The second question is that I was there in 2018, February. And there were kids with pencils roaming around some of those temples. And there's been no effort made to protect these temples. So how, and I was very intrigued that you mentioned that the V&A owner's son, went out there and was very intrigued. So why aren't British museums stepping in and helping the Indian government to realize that our children will not be able to see some of these things if they are not protected? It's been given a UNESCO Heritage Site, and yet no efforts whatsoever to protect them. So those are my two questions.
I think possibly John is better placed to sort of talk about the sort of protection of the site and its status than I am.
Do you want me to start?
Yeah, you go ahead.
It became a World Heritage Monument in mid-1980s, and I wouldn't say not much things changed then. More important was in mid-1970s, Hampi was declared one of three major medieval sites of national importance, and along with Photographic and Champaner, and if you've been to Photographic, you see how well it's taken care of. But it's a fairly dense and extensive, well-bounded series of monuments. Hampi is very spread out, for one thing. So the management is very difficult. It's not actually what the World Heritage listing is 58 monuments in the Hampi area. Some of the areas covered by a particular monument are quite large, covering several acres of land. But huge areas in between are not protected at all. And I just think that it's a gigantic problem to protect all these. There are private security guards all over the site, but they're not always very active, and they don't always try and control the kids running around on top of the monuments, or nor do their teachers, for that matter. It's a huge, difficult problem for them, and I don't know if it's money might help, but I think change of attitude might help a little bit more. And what was the other part of the question, Simon? Does that answer the question? I mean,
the first one was why it doesn't feature in one of the
I think
top
that's
10.
changing. I mean, one of the students of these two women that have done the extensive studies of the area around the center of the city did a study of the amount of lines given in guidebooks to Hampi over the years, and they found an increasing curve. So Hampi has increasingly more spaces in guidebooks, and we've ourselves done a couple guidebooks, and the one we've done in Hampi has sold more than any other guidebook, including the guidebook on the colonial architecture of Mumbai or Elephanta, and so forth. It's the biggest seller. So there is interest, and I think if you would go on to YouTube and look up Hampi, you would find, if you documented how many pictures were at different presentations were going on at different years, you would find the number of presentations going on. And we were sent a 3-hour presentation focused on Hampi that sort of used it as a touchstone to covering all of India's heritage. So it is increasing, and amongst the Indians, I think it's increased a lot. I haven't talked about the religious associations with the site, but better for worse, the association with Hanuman and the Ramayana have become very, very important there. And there's a hill on the northern side of the Tungabhadra River that's part of an axial alignment of various monuments and hills. And it's supposed to be Anjanadri Hill, where Hanuman's mother lived and where Hanuman was born. And there was a dinky probably 20th century little shrine up there that's been expanded on top of the rock, and a staircase goes up, and pilgrims go up in great numbers. And now somebody wants to pay for a 350-foot high statue of Hanuman on that hill. And it's going to become a Hindutva sort of focus, which will, and I don't know if those people that go to that shrine will care to go south of the river to see the other parts of the monument. They may, but they'll put the site in a particular context, and we haven't begun to talk about the ideological ramifications of the site, but that's a bit of a touch of that.
Any more questions?
We missed seeing the images which you had shown in the beginning. Is there any way we can access those images after this session?
Well, the photographs themselves are available to see in the library if you're a reader in the library. Some of them are online on the British Library website. I have to say that it's not the most finding them can be a little bit tricky sometimes. But all the material in the library is of course available to be used by readers, so it can certainly be seen. Yeah.
Some are online.
But not easy to access.
Well, not all of it is online. It's not really. We've had various projects. Or I say we. I'm no longer a member of the British Library. There have been various projects in the past to digitize some of those collections, but they haven't been done comprehensively yet. So it's very, it's a little bit hit and miss about what might be online and what might not. But there is certainly some Vijayanagara material that is online. Yeah.
Thank you.
In that case, if there are no further questions, may I just take this quick opportunity to thank you both, John Fitz and also John Falconer, for that fantastic conversation and providing us with some stunning photographs to look at and to search for in the future. And I'm sure they'd want a short plug for the forthcoming exhibition of that will be focused on Hampi here at the British Library in the autumn. I believe it opens in September. Yeah. So thank you very much indeed.